the recording right now. You probably get a pop-up asking for you to accept this, or otherwise you'll get kicked out, I'm afraid. Couple of things before we get started at the meetup itself, then I'll introduce myself and we'll get on to the agenda. It is being recorded. I will share the recording tomorrow and on YouTube, and post the links on the meetup page for this actual meetup. The slides that I'm going to be using are also going to be published there, and then the other materials that we might touch upon. Any references, any links, I will definitely share those as well. I do encourage participation in this meetup. So if you have any questions, concerns, own stories to share, or if you disagree with anything I say, feel free to speak up and contribute. I greatly appreciate that. You can also post your questions and things like that in chat. That is perfectly fine with me too. I will pause at some times for questions and things like that, but if you feel the urge to ask a question on the spot, that's perfectly fine. Anything else I should mention? No, I think that was basically it. All right, so welcome back to those that have been here before. I see a couple of familiar names. I do appreciate you coming back all the time and contributing. For those that are new here, my name is Martin. I'm an Agile coach at a company called Pro Awareness. I'm also a professional Scrum trainer at Scrum.org, meaning I get to teach a lot of fun classes like PSM and PSPO. My history is really in software engineering. I've been a DevOps engineer for a whole bunch of years before I sort of became a full-time Agile coach. I got introduced to Scrum in 2009, so it's about 12 years back. So have quite some history there. And I'm currently responsible for Pro Awareness's North American expansion, primarily here in the United States. And I'm based out of the beautiful city of Houston, Texas. And people typically laugh at me when I say beautiful city, because like there's nothing going on here really. And it's a nice city to live in. So Pro Awareness as a company, we've been doing this for about 15 years. We've got over 400 people worldwide, and a lot of coaches in there, a lot of coaching experience that sort of backs us up. And you can find us online on LinkedIn, on our website, in case you do need more context, more blogs and things we publish, and white papers. We're working on one of those too. So if you want like to gather some more knowledge or some references, feel free to visit us there. All right, so with the introductions out of the way, let's start with the outline for today's meetup. We're going to be talking about OKRs, objectives, and key results. So we're first going to very briefly look at the history. Goes back a little bit, OKRs. Then we're going to be looking at why would we even want to use them, followed by what they actually are. We'll go over like objectives, key results. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? But what does it really mean? What are a little bit of the specifics? And then we'll head into some examples. I got a total of 3 examples, and that's probably where some of the conversation will be, because OKRs are sort of like Scrum, right? They're very simple to understand, but very difficult to master, because it's super hard, especially if it's new to you, to get to proper KRs. Once we've gone over some examples, we'll look at how to use them, and then finally how we can combine them with frameworks like Scrum and SAFe, whether that is compatible at all, and ultimately followed by closing for questions. All right, so let's get to it. A history of OKRs. So OKRs are, and I got to do some quick math here, like almost 40 years old. Like that's how long they've been around. So Andrew Grove, he was a CEO at Intel. 1983, he wrote a book called High Output Management, and he used something at Intel that back then he called Intel Management by Objectives, so IMBOs, and that was actually sort of like the origin of OKRs. It sort of got renamed later, but what he did was really focus on setting clear objectives and having a tangible, measurable way to track progress, right? John Durr, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he's not here, so he's not going to know. He was actually there at Intel at the same time, right? And he picked up on that. And then he left Intel at one point and started working for a venture firm. And they were at Google. And he introduced this concept at Google. And it really took off there. And he's been working with OKRs for a long time. And then 4 years ago, he published a book, Measure What Matters, which really reignited the OKR movement, if you will. So that's a little bit of history. OKRs are definitely nothing new. They have been around for a long time. But over the past couple of years, and I guess especially since that book came out, that sort of like kickstarted the movement. And obviously Google's still using it, but also the other big firms are using it, like most companies are using it, I guess, these days, or at least to a certain degree. All right, so that's a little bit of history. So let's talk about why we would even want to use OKRs, right? Because like, is this a solution in need of a problem, or is there actually something wrong, right? So OKRs help you create extreme focus within an organization and extreme alignment to that. And this is something that a lot of organizations struggle with. Is this is what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. That's a whole bunch of things, right? And these are the overall objectives, like the strategy we set out for the organization. And it's really tough to have that add up, right? To make sure that everything, all the people within, especially a large organization, do on a daily basis actively and directly contributes to your business objectives, right? And that's the problem that OKRs tend to solve, right? So they help you focus on delivering valuable outcomes, not on output, right? So they put those objectives over output that you do, and they provide a measurable means towards actual business objectives. And I know it sounds a little bit abstract, and it'll make more sense once we get to the examples, right? But having that tangible, that measurable progress, that is pivotal in making sure, like, hey, are we actually on track? Or are we lacking? Do we need to do more? Can we do more? And because of that, they help create alignment, right? So if you focus on those objectives and making progress for those key results, right, that in itself provides alignment. And its simplicity is what really makes it powerful, right? Because they're quite simple, as you'll see in the examples, or maybe you already know because you've been using them for a while. And it's just like very clear. It's very simple. Like everybody can comprehend what they say, and they provide a certain flexibility instead of constraints, right? Because they're more strategic, ideally, if you're doing it right, and more high level, they allow the organization to be a little bit flexible with regards to what they have to do in order to get there. And that is especially important if you want to be an agile organization, right? You need that flexibility because we all recognize that we cannot simply come up with a plan and just stick to it, right? So that's why it works so well. And they also provide transparency, obviously, around your objectives and your strategy. And while that might seem like a trivial point, at many classes I teach, right? So I teach a lot of PSVO classes, and every time I ask them about their strategic objectives and their company vision, yada, 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 hardly ever anyone ever knows an answer to that question, right? They don't know what their business strategy is. They know what they're working on, right? They know what they want to do for their product, but they don't know what the business goals are. And if you use OKRs, you immediately create a sort of transparency around what that is, because they are going to be your primary focus. And I think that's quite a big point. So what are OKRs? OKRs are objectives and key results, right? So you set an objective, a business objective that you want the result, that is set to provide overall direction. And the key results are then means to track progress toward that objective. And they say, like, typically you want to have between 3 and 5 key results for an objective. You don't want there to be like too little, right? Too few key results, because then you're just like zooming in on one thing. But you also don't want to have like 9 or 10. I've had like a group of teams that were working with like 9, but then your focus is again all over the place because there's so many key results to track, right? So the objective should typically be achievable in a quarter. I know there's different opinions out there, right? So some people use a different cadence. The quarterly cadence is typically what works best in my experience. It's not too long, right? It's long enough for an actual strategic objective. And it's short enough to be like a sensible feedback loop. As same would say, for example, with their 12-week program increments, that's also roughly a quarterly cadence, right? So it's a good cadence to do certain things, especially looking at it from a strategic level. The thing with key results is that they should also always be measurable on the numeric scale, right? So you can do 0 to 100%, 0 to 10, 0 to 1, and you sort of like grade your progress or actually measure your progress. And it can be subjective and it can be objective. I'd say it's fine either way. You want them to be as objective as possible would be my inclination. Yeah, but sometimes that's simply not possible. So then you'd have to use a more subjective measure, and they should be very clear. There should be no ambiguity around them, so everybody understands like what the progress is we're making. Like, how do we measure this thing? And one very important thing to note is that OKRs are not features, PBIs, tasks, or things that you have to do. No, they're outcomes that you want to achieve, right? And again, that makes more sense once we'll get to the examples. Hang on, there's some background noise I'm picking up there. Click the mute button. And ideally, and this is just a little bit of a disclaimer, this happens mostly automatically, but you want to set that on like a team overarching level. I know there's organizations that do like personal OKRs as well, and then team OKRs, and then tribe OKRs, and then company OKRs. Then well, first of all, you're going to have to do even more alignment than you had to do in the first place, which you can also happen at so like waterfall remnants of like, we're going to do this first and then we're going to do that. It like reduces flexibility, if you will, right? So for example, if you're working in an agile release train, if you're using Safe or Tribe, if you're using Spotify model, then I'd say on that tribe release train level, that's like a perfect level for objectives and key results. It's close enough to the people actually doing the work that they feel they have responsibility and that they're actually contributing to it, yet strategic enough that it's not too nitty-gritty, I'd say. Any questions at this point? Lots of information, I know. When I was creating these slides, I was like, that's going to be like 3 or 4. And I was working at it. I was like, there's a lot about OKRs. Let's look at some examples here. That when I first got introduced, I was like, yeah, that's a great story. Now show me an example. Right. So this is an example that I've come up with, and this is one that I've actually used at a client. I've made it more anonymous. This is not how we started out, by the way. It was a lot worse. So the objective is start migration of web applications from on-prem to public cloud. Right. So that's the objective. That's what we want to achieve. We want to start. Right. But how do we measure that? Right. How do we make sure we're actually making progress towards this objective? So some of the key results here: achieve 10% in overall hosting cost reduction, increase uptime to 99.99% measured over a month, decrease deployment time to less than 10 minutes. Public cloud hosted applications should automatically scale to allow up to 100,000 simultaneous users, and reduce amount of tickets requiring manual intervention by 25%. What you see here with these key results, they're all business objectives. They're all outcome based, right? So we're not doing this migration just for the fun of it, right? We're doing it because we want to reduce those hosting costs, and we are happy if we're getting close to that 10% reduction. Uptime apparently was an issue, right? So we want to increase that, and we do believe that public cloud is going to help with that, right? We want to decrease deployment times, no more own machines, no more own equipment, right? We got all kinds of cloud technologies to leverage. They should scale automatically. Again, this was a clear upside for them, right? Otherwise, they had to purchase new servers and just rack them, and that's not really flexible. I can tell you that from my own experience. And manual intervention tickets, like the trivial stuff that this team or these teams had to resolve, they wanted to reduce that. So all of that like translate to business results. So I'd say if you're talking about OKRs, in my opinion, this is a good example of what you want to achieve. So, and it doesn't say what you have to do in order to achieve these things, right? So if you can find another way technically to achieve that 10% in overall hosting cost reduction, well, you're making progress towards the, I guess you could argue you might be making false progress towards the objective, but ideally you're doing it like with that migration, right? That's sort of the premise. But as you can see, you're getting closer once you make progress, and there's a lot of different things you could do within this objective and within these key results to make progress. Any questions about this before I move to a second example?
No questions, but this makes a lot of sense, Martin. Thanks.
All right. Happy to hear that. All right. So another example, a non-IT based example I wanted to get outside the IT sphere as well, is increase sales revenue by 25%. I actually came up with this when I was doing research for this forward blog post I'm writing. And I saw an example that was, well, not similar to this, but like a non-IT example as well. And it was like really bad. Like they gave you the wrong KRs. They were like, we want to increase revenue. So we got to talk to like whatever, to like 100 people. I can't remember anymore, isn't verbatim, but yeah. So we want to increase the sales revenue. How do we make progress towards it, right? So increase follow-up business from conferences by 100%, right? Generate 25% more business from existing clients and generate 50% more leads from online marketing campaigns. And for the last one, I'm a little bit, that's not something you really control, right? And how does that translate to revenue? So that last one I made up, that should be on the premise that you sort of know how much of those leads convert into sales revenue and what kind of revenue, right? That'll enable you to set such a directive, because then you know like it actually contributes to it. You can set it like in general, like we'll just guess it that it helps. But if you want to get closer to the objective, you might want to be sure that if you're achieving certain things, that will actually result in achieving that objective. Any questions or thoughts about this one? All right, so now I gave you 2 examples of how you should do it. Now there's an example how not to do it. And this is going back to my first example, right? So this is how it started out, that client migrate 3 applications from on-prem to public cloud. So the key results, migrate first application by the end of the month, right? That's like a binary key result. You've either done it or you haven't done it. That's not gradable. It's like either 0 or 100%, right? So there's like no flexibility. You're simply going to fail if you don't have that. We have a name for that. That's called waterfall, and they didn't want to do it anymore, so we changed it. So the other ones, right? Prepare 2 applications by the end of the 2nd month. Prepare 2 additional applications for the next quarter. Reduce number of on-prem servers by 10. What does that mean?
Measurable.
Well, some of them aren't, right? So the first 3 are not measurable. The last one is, but what does that mean for the business, right? You can take out 10 non-active servers and do all the other stuff. And then how have you been successful, right? So this doesn't really tell you anything. And that's why, and it's more like tasks, right? So reduce number of on-prem servers by 10. That's something I would see on like a backlog as something a team has to do. Same as like the first one, right? That's more like what you need to do in order to get there, not like what is the outcome that we're ultimately aiming for, right? So if you look at this, and then the first one, again, you really see the difference between like a good and bad OKR, right? It's really about the business outcomes that we need to achieve. And that's really the power of OKRs, because ultimately it's all about those business outcomes, right? And then the day-to-day work, obviously, I totally understand that people are busy on tactics, right? They're working on stuff they have to do on a day-to-day basis. So there could very well be migrating their first application. That's all perfectly fine, right? But it's not what we're ultimately aiming for. So that's why OKRs, in my opinion, are so incredibly powerful, because this does provide that overall direction. This does tell people like, hey, ultimately we're doing it in order to achieve this. And you can measure that progress now, right? Because you got measurable key results instead of like 3 binaries and 1 sort of like arbitrary, like, what is that even going to get us? Make sense? All righty. So,
Yes.
any questions? All right, so let's move on in that case. So how to use OKRs, how to start using them. So I think Samantha already made a little joke at the start. Is it like the quarter just started, so we're too late? OKRs are perfect to do in that quarterly cadence, as I mentioned before. And what I typically see is that before the quarter or the next program increment, in case you're using SAFe, before that starts, people spend some time on working on the objectives and key results for that next quarter, right? At that strategic level, this is what I talked about before, right? You don't want them to be too nitty gritty and all the way down to the team level. So I'd say executives, stakeholders, product owners, product management, depending on your framework and organizational layout that you're using. Management, middle management, that could definitely play a role in this. They should collaborate on setting OKRs. And more importantly, you also want to get feedback from the teams, right? Because that can be a big gap. Like, you can ask an entire group to come up with objectives and key results, but you've got to do a little bit of a feasibility check with the teams, right? Ultimately, strategy belongs at that executive level, right? So I think they should have a big say in this, right? They set the overall strategy, so why not have them be involved in this to ensure there's alignment? But we got to do the reality check with the teams, right? We can have like KRs, and the teams can say easily like, this is feasible or this is not feasible. You do want to do that, otherwise you're setting a KR which you know beforehand you're simply not going to make progress on because of whatever reason, right? It could be too ambitious. It could be that there's dependencies that we still need to resolve something. It could be that there's no stuff, something's not in place, or we don't have the knowledge. Like, you do want to have that check in there. And while you're setting those OKRs, you don't want to overdo it. Another big mistake I made with the previous client, when we got that wrong set of OKRs. I think we spent like 3 days with 20 people in a conference room, and that's what we ended up with. So it weren't even good OKRs, right? But we spent like hours wordsmithing them, and then like changing letters, changing words, and that's not really important, right? Because what is important is you set proper KRs. So typically 2 hours will be plenty to set strategy. Again, we're talking high level strategic, just objectives, right? The overall strategic direction of the organization or the department or the product line, whatever, should already be known, right? So that's a given. And you just try to align to that and see, what can we do? What is that big thing that we want to achieve in this quarter? And how are we going to measure it? So once you've set them and then you're in the quarter itself, time passes on, you do want to reflect on your progress throughout that quarter. And you might even need to adapt like what you're doing if needed. I wouldn't say adapt your OKRs. I mean, it's fine to fail at an OKR. I'd say it's pretty hard to fail at OKRs, but I'll get to that in a second. But you do want to do that at a regular cadence. I see lots of organizations and teams do it like at the end of every sprint. They just check their progress, right? Some have like fancy dashboards. I know at this client I was referring to before, we had it all set up to make sure that ultimately items in the product backlogs for the teams and the sprint backlogs were linked all the way up to the objectives and the key results. And you could actually automatically see like progress taking place in the dashboard towards OKRs that made these inspect and adapt sessions, as you will, very simple. We would just have a call every other week and look at like what was going on there, and the ones that were not making the progress that we thought they were, we're just going to look at, hey, what's going on there? Like, can we do something to help, or is there something we didn't know about? Like, do we need to adjust something? And we could see progress, and that helped a whole bunch, right? The principle of OKRs helped a whole bunch because we had something to talk about. Before, it was like a PO sync, and everybody would give like an update and talk a little about, yeah, I'm busy with this, I'm busy with that, and like what does that provide us, right? But now we had something to talk about. It got a lot more focused, right? So it was a lot more to the point, like, hey, we're doing this in order to get there, and all the other stuff became irrelevant, right? So you were actually, and this was OKRs like doing what they're supposed to be doing, like you're making progress towards an objective, and before like they didn't, and there wasn't a way to measure it. So success means 70% completion, give or take, right? And that's to my comment before, it's super hard to fail at OKRs because like only if you make no progress, I'd say you've almost really failed at it. But it's all about making progress. Again, it's progress over perfection in that sense that you want to get closer to that objective. And as long as you're getting closer, even if it's not at the rate that you would want to, you're making progress towards that objective. However, with 70%, you've made a whole bunch of progress, right? So that would tell me you're focused on actually getting to the objective. And the reason why you're saying 70%, and it took me a little bit to wrap my own head around this, right, and not 100%, is that they wanted to allow for space for low risk competitive goals, like sort of like stretch goals. And that became less and less of a popular term, like the agile world, the past couple of years. I know SAFe sort of like changed them into like uncommitted goals or whatever. But within OKRs, again, it's more about making that progress towards your objective than necessarily completing all of that, right? So, and what you'll notice is that just by using this sort of properly, you're going to make so much more progress than before that you're not going to be worried about that 30%. But that 30% that does allow, like, hey, whatever there, what else can we do? Can we be a little bit more ambitious and competitive? And if you're hitting 100% all the time, it might be that you're not ambitious enough and you're missing an opportunity to deliver more value or deliver more valuable business outcomes, right? That's why they're saying low risk, like you don't need to get to that 100, right? So you can be ambitious. It is encouraged to be ambitious. But yeah, getting to that 70%-ish, that's perfectly fine. But if you hit the hundreds, you might want to like readjust a little bit in the next quarter. And then you sort of rinse and repeat this every quarter, right? I've seen a lot of varieties in the past 2 years. Like some of them had to be shifted because no progress was made for whatever reasons, dependencies we uncovered. Sometimes we came up with a whole new set because we were satisfied with the progress towards that objective, and the executives said like, hey, we're satisfied with the progress here too, so let's move on to this next big strategic thing. Other times it was like just a second iteration for the one. So the example I gave before, start migration of web applications from on-prem to the public cloud. We got to a second iteration of this, right? We really don't want it to migrate the majority of simple applications, and with different KRs, obviously, so that sort of builds on it. And yeah, again, I can't emphasize enough, this was a huge success, but it took us like a year to really get the hang of this. And that's mostly because, well, one of them was management pressure. The other one is like making sure that we got really good at setting KRs, right? We failed miserably at setting proper KRs. I'm going to pause again, see if there are any questions. All right. Oh, I see somebody's hand waving.
Yes, hi. This is Amy. I've been writing OKRs with my team as an agile coach for the last 2 years.
Nice.
But I'm actually looking for any like certification or further advanced coaching, because I did face most of the issues you have mentioned around people not going back to review them, writing poor OKRs, just writing them as a tick in the box rather than to deliver value. So yeah, do you recommend any further certifications or trainings?
Well, I know there's lots of companies, including ourselves, that do like OKR workshops, right? Where we come in, or they come in to sit down with the team and really reflect on what they're doing and sort of have a session around it, around their actual OKRs. I am not aware of any certification that's out there. I'm not sure if anybody else in the call knows, and I'd be happy to do a little bit of research, see if I can find some of that, but I haven't over the past couple of days of the research, so I'm not really sure if it exists, even certification. Anybody else have an idea?
Thank you, Mark.
Certification in writing OKRs?
Yeah.
Yes.
Not by itself, but I assume that you can get a little more training in writing OKRs by getting trained on being a portfolio manager.
Right. That's a
Yeah.
good
suggestion.
insight. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because that was some part of that training.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, Samantha, because that portfolio management, like SAFe by itself, has more strategic direction setting that you could say aligns a little bit with OKRs, but it's a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had to think back because I'm a certified lean portfolio manager. So I think we had that. And yeah, but then there's so much more. So I wouldn't just recommend it for writing OKRs. It's really just part of it. But I have seen actually some good YouTube videos on them. So
Great.
yeah,
Thank you, Samantha.
yeah. So you might want. Oh, I forgot that guy's name. But there's like it's like an hour and a half kind of a video, and
Yeah.
he actually goes through this OKR with like audience, and corrects them. So when you see how people would think about the OKRs, you can see how you can correct them as well. So yeah, I cannot remember his name, but it's
Well, if you
about an
find
hour
it,
and a
feel free
half.
to let me know, Samantha. I can, or you can post it in the Meetup group
Yep.
on the page for this event. We can share it
Sounds
there if we
great.
can
Thank
find
you
it.
both.
Sure, and great question. If there's no certification, that might be a good business idea, actually, come to think of it.
Yeah.
So
But
I'll give you
usually
credits.
businesses want someone who knows how to do the PI planning. And part of the PI planning is writing the OKRs, right?
If you're using SAFe.
So, right.
Yeah.
I mean, but I don't think you don't care if it's safe or any other thing, right? You don't care. You just want to know how to write OKRs better, right?
Yeah, you can write
Yeah,
them
yeah.
anytime and review
Right.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just part of the planning. And so usually when businesses ask someone who knows how to do this OKRs, usually they have experience in planning. So also that could be part of that too. I think Agilist also gives training on how to do this planning. So writing the OKRs could be part of that. So
It's strategic
that's
planning,
another
basically.
one.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's the whole. So there's not one thing.
No.
Writing the OKRs. It's a package into many different disciplines.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things are like the PI planning, the portfolio management, and things like that gets tied into this OKRs. So yeah.
All right. If you want to follow up later, Amy, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. If I
Yep.
find something, I can send it to you.
Sure. Thank you, Martin.
All right. Great question. All right. So let's get to the final like really content slide that I have for today, using OKRs with frameworks, right? Technically, OKRs are a framework by itself, right? The principle of doing OKRs could be considered a framework. However, because it's, and I go back to the comment at the start, it's so lightweight, it is easily compatible with other frameworks and practices. Like if you're using Scrum, like Scrum provides really nothing, and they're probably not going to be happy at Scrum.org when they hear this, but they provide nothing for overall direction setting, right? They provide ways to inspect and adapt, and it's a powerful framework, but like you got to figure a whole bunch of things out yourself. And I think OKRs can be really powerful if you have a bunch of teams doing Scrum with like no alignment mechanisms in the first place, because that will fix a lot of things, right? I mentioned before, if you're using SAFe, it's perfectly compatible with SAFe. I think it will even be an accelerator if you're using it in SAFe, because SAFe already has a lot of powerful structures and practices in place that help, especially large enterprises, like deliver value and make that progress. And if you use OKRs, that's really an accelerator. Samantha already mentioned it. You can use it around your PI planning. You want to prepare it a little bit and then set them in PI planning. That fits in perfectly. And we have plenty of examples of organizations and clients of ours actually doing it. I actually see my coworkers here who I was talking to about this, but she doesn't seem to be on a call. She might have had another example. Next is another scaling framework from Scrum.org. But yeah, it's compatible with that too. Spotify model. Again, nothing holds you back. And Spotify model is in quotes because technically not a model, but let's not go down that road today. So you can just use it in addition to these things. There's not a lot of changes necessary or hardly any changes necessary in order to start doing that. I think the biggest challenge, like in general, you might be facing is making sure you get the right people around the table and then setting proper key results for your objectives. Coming up with objectives, again, probably not the hardest thing is those key results, right?
I think you read my mind about the Spotify model.
Yeah.
I mean, they just renamed it, you know, it's basically safe. Can you explain more about the Nexus?
I could, but I think that's a little out of context. Now, Next is sort of like a lightweight sort of Scrum proof way of scaling. And it was born around the time where, well, Save was popular and Scrum.org didn't have a scaling answer. And back in those days, Safe was not doing Scrum properly. They changed a bunch of terminology and they weren't happy about that. So it's more like a political movement driven thing, I think, than anything else. But there's a whole website about that. So you go to Scrum.org and click Nexus. Yeah, it's a framework. Yeah, it's a scaling framework. It's super lightweight and it works. It works, but it's not popular as Safe. Not by a long stretch. Yep. But yeah, you're an SBC, so you know. All right, so yeah, just to wrap this up, the OKRs do provide that overall direction if frameworks fall short, or they can be an accelerator like with Safe, and it can also replace existing similar solutions if desired. So for Safe, you do set BI objectives, so it nicely fits into that, or you set certain stretch goal. You could sort of like play with that and change that a little bit, or uncommitted goals, I should say. So yeah, and whichever framework you're going to be using it with, if you're using it at the right layer, I don't think it's going to be disruptive in any way. It's just going to provide more focus, which is ultimately what we want. All right, so, oops, I thought press the button and then we'll move on. That didn't happen. So yeah, I want to see if there's any questions, any remarks, any discussion. This is all that I had for today. Feel free to ask any questions or. Let me ask a question too, to think about, maybe like, who of you has been using OKRs and what is your experience so far?
It's very useful if you have it, if you do it correctly.
Yep.
And that sets up the whole tone and coming up with the roadmap. So.
Yep. Lucy, I believe you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you. We just had some new leadership coming in, and they talked about OKR. So this is very helpful to set up some context as to what's to come. And so I haven't had any experience yet, but it's coming. I'll let you know how it works.
Nice. Yeah. Oh, please do. And again, you can just grab the slide deck and make some changes and just share it with your organization. That's perfectly fine. So
thank you so much.
Nice. Exciting to hear that you're going to start doing this. I got a question here from Tara. What do you think of OKRs for Agile? How the Scrum teams are performing? That is a good question. I have tried that in the past, but in my experience, it was very difficult to set because you're focused on valuable business outcomes, right? So, and then we talked about stuff like team performance, and then it's like, and it's a little, I guess what we ultimately ended up with was sort of like, look at the amount of value, and this was really hard, like the amount of value that teams were delivering, and sort of like stuff like reducing cycle time. And for us, it didn't really work in a way that it didn't have a clear advantage or a clear positive effect. So we stopped doing it at one point. We much rather focused on like, what can we do in order to support the teams to meet those actual business objectives rather than progress towards, with regards to Scrum, right? So we found a little bit of a struggle. Do you have experience with it? Have you tried it or?
Sorry, I had to unmute.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
actually my management is kind of, I shouldn't say kind of, they're very interested in that.
Okay.
So trying to figure out how it should look or how it should work and what we should be focusing on.
I'd be curious to hear what they're trying to achieve. Like what is driving this ask for what we said OKRs for how the Scrum teams are performing? Because if you're management, you want to have the OKRs that we looked at before, right, and have those business outcomes. And you'll see if your teams are performing properly based on your progress towards those key results, right? If you're not making a lot of progress and there's no other reason why you're not making that progress, like no dependencies or vendors that are not delivering something, then you might look into that a little bit, right? So yeah, I'd say that could give them the answer that they're looking for. But again, first question, like why?
Yeah.
Why would you want me to do this? Do you know why they?
I don't, and that is a good question. So I will try to turn that.
Uncover that.
You know, you can still use the OKRs for teams, but not necessarily for the performance.
Yeah.
So teams can come up with their OKRs to be able to plan the team work over the course of the quarter. And, you know, Martin, you know this, I always talk about this. It's not about, you know, one layer of the business, like the Scrum teams being able to plan and do things. Agility is very fluid. So it's all about alignment. Why do we do OKRs and why do we plan? Communication and transparency is just half of that equation, but the purpose is to be able to align. So they can still do the OKRs at a team level to plan what they're trying to achieve, not necessarily about performance,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have done that very successfully, actually. If the teams can come up with their own sets of OKRs and then they work towards that and then, you know, break the work down and then, you know, plan it in the Scrum or, you know, Kanban, they can still do that, you know. I mean, I guess ultimately, if you really think about it, you know, it can tie to the performance down the road, many steps down the road, but it's not about the performance. What is it that teams are delivering that brings business value to the clients? That's what's important.
Okay, great. Thank you both.
Great suggestion, Samantha. Yep. Sheila has her hand up.
Yeah, I missed the first part of the discussion. So you may have talked about this, but I heard you talking about if you're hitting 100% of your OKRs, you're not setting your goals high enough.
Yep.
Now, my concern here is if that's something that management knows about and you've set something that's sort of a stretch goal, my experience is that whatever you set gets carved in stone, even if it's something that you're looking at as something that may or may not happen. What do you do to manage management expectations so that it doesn't become something that's a negative against the team if you don't hit something that you set as not necessarily, but hopefully achievable?
Yeah, Tom is suggesting not to tell them, but yeah, you sort of need their involvement. So I guess so what I actually did in the past, there was the same nervousness, right? So we hit 100% for 2 quarters in a row, and then they got used to it, they got familiar to it, and then we were able to bring it back to 70 and get in some stretch goals, right? So we first had to build a little bit of trust that this was actually working, that this was actually a good thing, and then we started playing with those KRs a little bit. Once it was on track and they understood, because like if you're introducing this, and Kamlesh, this is actually to your question as well. So if your organization not using it, how do you convince them to start using it? Obviously, it's a new concept you're introducing, and you want it to be risk-free for them. And you can just start doing this. You can do it officially or unofficially, set those objectives and sort of start working towards it and sort of build that trust over time. And in my experience, if you're introducing it and then you build that trust, even if it's through like 2 quarters hitting 100%, then you can start introducing those stretch goals. This is one for the long run, right? So this is not something you're going to do for a couple of months and then move on to the next big thing. Well, Google has been doing it for the past 22 years, right? So, and they're still doing it because, well, it's super simple. It doesn't age, right? It's always relevant. And so again, if it's 2, 3, 4 quarters when you're like sort of hitting 100% and then you start doing it 70%, I'd say you're doing very fine. I say that's a natural path.
I could see though, if you were hitting 100% and now you're hitting 70%, that management's going to come back and say, what's wrong? That the OKRs aren't working anymore. What's wrong with the team?
That would be your call based upon your management, right? So either it can be used as a mechanism to help them get on board with the principle of OKRs and then explain them as you go along how it works, right? It's sort of along the same strategy that coaches sometimes use with daily scrums, where they run for 30 minutes and they're just going to let that go for the first couple of weeks. And then they're going to say like, hey guys, actually this is supposed to be 15 and then we're just going to reduce that. But if you're afraid that might have the opposite effect, then you have to be strong on this from the start and explain them like 70% is like hitting your goal. You're just going to have to educate them. Yeah, that really depends on how your management is, I guess.
Yeah, and it probably depends on how much you can get their undivided attention, where they're actually like listening and not just yesing.
Taking in the words, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah. So it's tricky.
Actually changed that word. So
Stretch.
I actually like stretch, because I feel like it's a little has more positive connotation, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they changed to non-committed or something like that. And that feels like, okay, we'll do this if we have time, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's uncommitted.
You know?
And I know what
Yeah,
happens to
and
uncommitted
I
items.
don't
They
like
always
that.
get bumped to the bottom of the
Yeah,
list. There's no ambition
so-
to get them done anymore.
SAFE changed the name stretch items to non-committed. And I object to that, actually.
Yeah, it's good to be a little bit ambitious. But it's a great question, Sheila. And I'm sorry there's no black and white like go-to solution.
Well, and I like the word stretch a lot better than non-committed as well,
Oh, yeah.
because stretch
Yeah.
is something you want to do and you intend to do, and
Yeah.
non-committed is maybe I'll get around to it.
Exactly. That is exactly my point. Because I think when they call it stretch, it's like they actually, intend to start it, but they may not commit to actually finishing it. So they actually start the work. Whereas like non-committed, it has that thing like, you don't even start it because we don't have the time for it, kind of thing,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Agreed.
All right.
I don't know who has the authority to change this name. I mean, it's just so wrong. I feel
Dean
like
Leffingwell.
I'm telling you, I personally object to this. This is just so wrong. Stretch is so much better than non-committed.
I know a couple of SPCTs. They might be able to. They have the right connections, so might be able to get that feedback in.
I think
not sure
you
if it'll
should
help.
protest for me as well.
Yeah, it's actually a good point that you're surfacing here. You might need to talk to them about this. I'm not saying I know them all.
Me and Sheila.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Any other questions? I totally forgot to wrap this up actually, like officially. So the next meetup is going to be like 3 weeks from now, July 28th. It's going to be about story points by popular request from the last one. Yeah, if you've been here, I'll love to see you back next time.